I introduce this panel today, I'd like to thank those of you who made our incredible Inflato contest this past Friday such a great success. Our jury has made their decision about a contest winner. They have selected the OVA Inflato, designed and constructed by Dan Anthony, Alyssa Fanit-Dusac, and Anthony White. Congratulations to Team OVA Inflato. And thanks again to our judges, Sunshine Kesey, Lawrence Fong, and Albert Nerith for making such a difficult decision. I can vouch that they were really racked with stress about it because they love them all so much. We also had a public vote for our People's Choice Prize, for which we received hundreds of votes. This vote made it clear how excellent all of the Inflato entries were because it was also very close. And we received many comments on the ballots about what made each design so compelling and special. The winners of the People's Choice Prize was the Inflato Globe, designed and built by Nick Kohler, James Meacham, Jesse Clark, and Sonia Anthony. So congratulations to Team Inflato Globe as well. And thanks again to all our contest participants, to our sponsor, Master Capital Management, and to everyone on the museum staff who made the contest possible. I also want to encourage all of you to come to our upcoming events. This coming Wednesday on March 6th at 5:30, we have an artist talk by Julie Green, whose exhibition is in our artist project space and just opened this weekend. I also encourage you to check that out before leaving the museum. Next week at 7 p.m. on March 13th, we have local experimental filmmaker Lauren Sears presenting his Haight Ashbury Quartet. For more information, check out the West of Center calendars at the front desk or check our website. When we began planning our public programming for West of Center, we had several distinct goals in mind. Central to these goals was fostering a dialogue about the 1960s and 70s counterculture for Oregon and Eugene specifically. The speakers we have gathered together for this panel represent a cross-section of Eugene's countercultural community, though I'm guessing the audience does as well. I'm going to introduce all the speakers first, and then each speaker will come up in turn. Then we'll bring everyone to get back together at the end for some conversation and audience questions. Also, I encourage you to fill out the surveys on your seats because we appreciate feedback about all of our public programs. So first, on our panel today, we have Suzy Prozanski. Suzy is author of the book Fruit of the Sixties, The Founding of the Oregon Country Fair, and has attended the fair since 1984. To document the fair's beginning, she interviewed more than 300 fair participants and researched archived newspaper files, early fair records, and other sources. A journalist for more than 2 decades, Suzy worked for the Houston Post and the Register Guard in Eugene, and has taught copy editing as an instructor at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. Second, you will hear from Ron Eachus, who graduated University of Oregon, class of 1970, and served as editor of the Oregon Daily Emerald from 1968 to 69. Later in life, he served as an Oregon legislator and was chairman of the state's Public Utility Commission for 14 years. These days, Ron is a political columnist for the Salem Statesman Journal. Third, we will have Sparky Roberts. Sparky is an all-around theater artist who teaches intro to theater, acting, improvisation, and acting Shakespeare. She earned a BA in psychology and an MFA in acting from Brandeis University. Sparky is also a member of the National Association of Drama Therapists. Actress, director, and teacher, Sparky founded the New Mime Circus Theater Ensemble in 1972. Her recent creative collaborations have taken her to Great Britain and Holland. And finally, we will have Kim Still. Kim Still was raised by artists in the woods of South Eugene. She's been a Saturday market vendor, the manager of the Bijou, and for 21 years, the promotions manager at Saturday Market. So thanks again for coming, and here's Suzy.
Thank you for inviting me to be on today's panel. I didn't live here during the 1960s and the 70s, but I have done a lot of research about it for my book on the history of the Oregon Country Fair. It seems to me that the fair today embodies many of the ideals and values evident in the amazing exhibit upstairs. The fair's mission statement, it doesn't want to go for me. There we go. That's the correct direction. The fair's mission statement says, the Oregon Country Fair creates events and experiences that nourish the spirit, explore living artfully and authentically on earth, and transform culture in magical, joyous, and healthy ways. The lifestyle of alternative culture, especially living artfully and lightly on the land, has been celebrated at the fair since its beginnings. For 4 decades now, the 3-day fair has popped up as regularly as a modern-day Brigadoon with a counterculture slant. But a funny thing happened on the way to the future. What was considered normal in the early 1960s stands out today as overly stiff and formal. And what was considered wild in the 60s looks quaint by today's standards. I believe a similar case could be made for so-called counterculture values, such as respecting all peoples, working together in cooperation, and encouraging creative self-expression. All of those ideals are much more evident in our mainstream culture today. I first attended the Oregon Country Fair in 1984 when I moved here from Texas. My husband and I were amazed by the vaudeville acts, the people, the energy, the vibes. By 1990, we were volunteering on the info crew at the fair. 2 very good friends have passed on, but they inspired me to write about fair history. Gil Harrison, a potter from Cottage Grove, and Wally Slocum, a longtime fair volunteer who was a librarian at the U of O library, law library. Gil and Wally helped put the fair together each year at Main Camp in the 1970s, and they both served on the earliest fair board of directors. They told me lots of great stories. There were few written documents from the early fair, so researching fair history was a challenge. The fair has always operated as a collective, and nobody had the whole story. Everybody just came and did their own piece of it. But Gil and Wally had lots of fair friends and introduced me to them, and I introduced their friends and friends of their friends, eventually talking to more than 300 fair folks. It soon became clear that placing events from people's memories into the year it actually happened would be another challenge. So I researched hundreds of news articles from the Times to help me figure it out. The research revealed that a wave of migration hit Eugene in the late 60s and early 1970s. Part of the reason for this migration can be traced to Lane County's legacy of peace activism. One of the first rallies against the Vietnam War was held at the University of Oregon in April 1965. The UO protest was held simultaneously with a huge peace rally in Washington, D.C. that was sponsored by the Students for Democratic Society, also known as the SDS. Here at the UO, sponsored included 81 university faculty, 7 staff, and 127 students. They put together faculty-led group discussions, singing circles, and a midnight torchlight rally. The rally's highlight was a speech by Oregon's own U.S. Senator Wayne Morse, a fervently outspoken opponent of the war. He was one of only 2 senators who voted against the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorizing the Vietnam War. The principled stands taken by Senator Morse made Oregon seem a safe haven for peace activists and young men seeking to avoid the draft. It's notable that in Eugene, protests often included city council members, clergy, and others in the mainstream. On the UO campus, the protest intensified until the Vietnam War finally ended. This slide shows Ron Eachus as student body president in 1971. In the mid-'70s, Ron also coordinated a speakers forum in the forest that was politically slanted or connected at the country fair. I didn't mean slanted. Sorry. Lane County's legacy of peace activism, coupled with Oregon's live and let live traditions and verdant countryside, made this area a magnet for migration during the late 60s and early 70s. Many young people in the Back to the Land movement blazed a new Oregon Trail. And that's Miss Toby Alves over there. A lot of communes participated in the first fairs. This ad in the Augur newspaper mentions a commune info center at the fair. The Register Guard ran several feature articles about this influx of people who sometimes called themselves hippies or freaks. In a 1971 article, police estimated 10,000 so-called longhairs had landed in the area since 1968. Other estimates put it closer to 20,000. Many came here from the Bay Area after the Haight-Ashbury scene hit rough times. Others came from across the country, simply heading out west and winding up here. Some experimented with unconventional lifestyles and lived in communes. In 1971, the Register Guard reported counting 56 multifamily living arrangements in the Lane County area. Butler Green Farm was one of many communes that participated in the early fairs. And like many, Butler Green's former residents stayed to live and work in the area after the commune broke up. Nowadays, former Butler Green residents still gather each year at the fair to run the Divine Balance fruit salad booth. One key goal of the earliest fairs was to create a market where crafters and communes could sell their works and make a living without selling their soul out to corporate America. That only partly worked out. The communes didn't last, but a number of crafters and food booths today do make a living selling their crafts at the fair and the Saturday market. They're kind of sister organizations. A further draw for people who moved here in the 70s was famed author and merry prankster Ken Kesey, who lived in Pleasant Hill. Kesey was, of course, famous for his own books, but the story of the merry prankster's 1960s road trip by bus, as told by author Tom Wolfe in The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, helped elevate Kesey to a cultural icon. Ken Kesey was a regular fair participant from the earliest days, often as a featured speaker on main stage. The first fair was held 44 years ago on November 1st and 2nd, 1969, as a small fundraiser for an alternative school. It was known then as a Renaissance Fair. I was surprised to learn the first fair was held in November, outside. It was an extraordinarily nice fall day with low morning clouds giving way to afternoon sunshine. It was so nice, in fact, that many people who were there remembered it as happening in late summer. Since 1970, Whitebird Clinic has sponsored a first aid booth at the fair, marking the beginnings of rock medicine in Eugene. In keeping with its values to live lightly on the land, the fair in 1973 contracted with Bring Recycling to create a model project of trash recycling, a partnership that has continued for decades. At the time, only cans and glass bottles were able to be recycled. Now the fair recycles more than 80% of the waste collected on site, including composting food waste. Then there's a performance art at the fair, which really matches this exhibit. In 1975, Reverend Chumley came with his unique brand of left-leaning new vaudeville. He met Peggy Wendell, who would become his partner for many years. Peggy's alias was Spike Wilder. Notice the bed of nails under Spike. Chumley brought the first marching band to the fair in 1975. The first band paraded around the pathways with only 6 members, one of whom played fiddle. The irregular marching band instantly became a popular fair tradition and quickly grew in size. They named themselves the Fighting Instruments of Karma Marching Chamber Band/Orchestra. They still parade along the paths today. Chumley also invited the Flying Karamazov brothers, who at first had only 2 jugglers. Over the years, the Karamazovs gained members and became fair favorites. Other new vaudeville entertainers who came to the fair in the 70s still return regularly to perform, notably fire breather and sword swallower Mose Wright, bubble guide Tom Noddy, and the Royal Famille du Caniveau, the royal family from the gutter. New vaudeville entertainment remains hugely popular at the fair. In the mid-70s, fair organizers faced a lawsuit from the California Renaissance Fair over the use of the name. Rather than fight, organizers here changed the event's name and adopted the peach logo. In 1976, the fair created an appropriate technology area that morphed the next year into Community Village. The entire project took root during discussions among the nonprofit groups who were renting space at Growers Market at the time. Those nonprofits worked together to co-create Community Village using consensus decision-making. Community Village continues to be governed by consensus and has blossomed ever since. In 1977, fair attorney Jill Hyman filed the legal work for the fair to be recognized as a nonprofit by the state of Oregon. In April 1980, with Jill's guidance, the fair became a federally recognized 501c3 nonprofit offering, quote, cultural information, crafts, and technical demonstrations, including workshops and demonstration projects on solar energy, cooperatives, farming, and music. In 1981, the appropriate technology area expanded out of Community Village into its own place and was renamed Energy Park. In 1982, the fair made its first down payment to purchase the land along the Long Tom River. One reason the fair could afford the land was because it floods every year. Now the fair acts as a land steward as well, protecting the wetlands and the floodplains and letting the river meander naturally. Over the decades, the fair has metamorphosed into a rare breed, a self-sustaining and lively arts festival that is also a thriving nonprofit. The fair's endowment fund, the Jill Hyman Vision Fund, and other donations by the fair's board of directors has helped fund projects at numerous organizations in Lane County. After 4 decades, Country Fair participants now span 3 and 4 generations. That's Girl Circus. Those are daughters and granddaughters of performers. Many people who participate in the fair's first decade still attend, as do their children and grandchildren, and in some cases, great-grandchildren. Many children and grandchildren of original fairgoers now volunteer on crews or participate in stage shows. There are multi-generational food booths and craft booths. After 4 decades, the fair brings families and friends together still for psycho-spiritual rejuvenation. Some things have changed, but a lot hasn't. The Oregon Country Fair is a place where aging hipsters, sacred tricksters, and new vaudevillians, plus their children and grandchildren, still gather to celebrate our cultural community. Thank you.
So next up, we'll have Ron Eachus. You don't have a slideshow, right?
Okay. I need a place to put this, though. Could we move this over a little bit? Okay, thank you. I'm sure you'll all understand the need for these. If you haven't read Suzy's book, excuse me, I want to recommend it very highly. While it focuses on the fair and many of the events of the 70s, it sets the stage by talking about the 60s, and appropriately called The Fruits of the 60s. If you read through that book, you will see and learn and understand all of the things that exist today whose seeds were sown during that period of time in the 60s. I don't have any slides. There's a lot of pictures I'd just as soon not show, like the one Suzy showed. I don't really have, you can sort of imagine what it's like when he said, tell me about the 60s in 15 minutes. So I'm going to confine this to sort of more of a personal reminiscence and more towards what was going on campus. And in so doing, I'll be shortchanging a lot of things going on in the community. But it's often joked of the 60s that if you remember the 60s, you really weren't there. To whom to attribute the quote is debatable. Among candidates are comedians such as Robin Williams or Paul Kantner, who was a San Francisco-born founder of the Jefferson Airplane Band. It's meant as a comedic take on a period that was filled with change in political activism and openness in society as the World War II baby boomers came of age, of which I was one. And I'm guessing from the looks of it, so were many of you. Its obvious reference to the effects of a culture of drugs like marijuana and LSD makes it work as a comedy, but its sort of truthiness kind of stops there. So I really don't know what people always want to know about the 60s, because there's plenty of events and there's a lot of trends to contemplate. It was truly a historic time with repercussions that are still felt today. But to me, the term the 60s refers more to a general period of time than to a specific time period beginning on January 1, 1960 and ending December 31st, 1969. The reality is that its lineage begins in the 50s with the civil rights movement and extends into the 70s with many of the things that Suzy talked about. The early 60s were my high school years. Isolated as I was in a small agricultural timber town like Molalla, Oregon, you could still feel the weight of the world. Television was bringing the civil rights movement and the hatred and ignorance and bigotry of racism into the living room. President Kennedy was shot. President Johnson got Congress to allow him the authority to wage war in Vietnam. By the time I started college, the forces that would shape the 60s had begun. The civil rights movement was moving towards making the Civil Rights Act of 1964 a reality. The war was escalating. Johnson's war on poverty was unmasking economic inequities and helping open college campuses to minorities. The free speech movement at the University of California, Berkeley, had fought for the right for students to free speech and the ability to actually bring political activism over off-campus issues onto campus. The Freedom Rider buses of the civil rights movement that ushered into the 60s were soon replaced with different symbolic buses in the late 60s. There was the Magic Bus of the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour. There was Further, the bus of Ken Kesey's Electric Kool-Aid acid test sojourn. And there was the Draft Bus, periodically taking young men to report to their physicals. When I began college, I had no inkling of where future events would take me. I was simply a small-town kid trying to adjust to the social and academic life of college by going home nearly every weekend. My passion was sports, my career choice journalism. In high school, my favorite books were Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein and The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. Things changed. The movement from the early 60s in high school to college. It was in with Rod McEwen and Gordon Lightfoot, and out of the 60s with Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead. It was in with American Bandstand, out with Woodstock. In with the Beatles, and well, kind of out with the Beatles. It was in with I Want to Hold Your Hand, and out with Imagine. It was in with the war in the hills and cities of Vietnam, and out with a battle over the war in the streets of the U.S. and 4 dead in Ohio. It was in with Ayn Rand. Excuse me, I have a cold. It was in with Ayn Rand, out with Noam Chomsky. It was in with a college draft deferment, and out with a you couldn't get in even if you wanted to physical exemption. It was in with the crew cut, out with long hair and a headband. To understand a period, it I think helps to know a little bit about the University of Oregon and Eugene at the time. In 1965, when I first came to the place that would eventually be my home for over 20 years, gas was 25 cents, tuition $100 a term. Eugene was still basically a timber town, albeit one with a liberal arts university. City and state politics were dominated by Republicans, many of whom were the moderate good civics kind that today are increasingly hard to find. The Oregon legislature was elected by counties, not by single-member districts. The campus was by and large an isolated part of the community, except for its athletic program. There was a dry zone around campus. Maxie's, 3 blocks down 13th Street, 3 long blocks down 13th, was the closest bar. Campus social life and student government were dominated by frats and sororities. Sometimes, an aside, I'll tell you of one of the scariest moments I ever had, which was going to speak to a sorority. But a canoe fete on the mill race during Parents' Weekend was the big event of the year. Traffic, including log trucks, went straight through campus down 13th Street, except during the 10 minutes that were set aside between classes. The university was run by the faculty, and students weren't even allowed to attend meetings. The free speech platform was seldom used. Football was played at Hayward Field. Football wasn't Oregon's strong point then. Track and field, though, was. As a freshman sports reporter, one of the first events I covered was an Oregon-Washington State game. With a few seconds to go and Oregon in position to kick the winning field goal, the Oregon quarterback threw the ball out of bounds to stop the clock. The only problem was it turned out to actually be 4th down. Game over. That year, Oregon had a losing season with several more to follow. The track team had just won its 3rd national championship in 4 years. Now, I mentioned football not just because I was a sports fanatic, but because I recall a time when members of the football team shoved and assaulted, quote, hippies who had been drawing peace symbols and other colorful chalk drawings on the student union sidewalk. The players said the hippies were giving the university a bad image. This led to a big public debate over whether or not to lean on the hippies or to lay off the hippies. Given their record, there were many who responded that it was the football team that was giving the school a bad image. This incident was an early sign of the changes that were happening on campus. During around the same time, you may recall a managing editor of the Oregon Daily Herald, Annette Buchanan, did a story about 7 unnamed students who admitted that they occasionally used marijuana. The Lane County District Attorney tried to force her to reveal the names. She didn't do it and was fined $300, lost an appeal to the Supreme Court. But in 1973, the Oregon legislature passed a reporter's shield law protecting sources and unpublished information. The demographics of the student population were changing then. Not only more students, but more diverse in background and experience. The old social order didn't command the authority, credibility, and respect that it once did. The campus was opening up to the outside world, and the outside world was more and more tumultuous. People were speaking out because it was time to do so. Now, counterculture is a pretty broad term, and it took many forms, but it existed because there were norms that needed a counter. The embrace of war, the conscription of soldiers, racism, poverty, and the stubborn resistance to increase civil rights, materialism, conformism, respect for authority, and the expectation about how to behave, to know your place, and to not speak up. All perceived as negatives needing a counter, more free expression, experimentation. People took different paths in the counterculture. There was kind of a clash between how much to drop out or how much to weigh in. Whether to dance uninhibited a be-in or show up and participate at a teach-in. Change the world, or at least change the way you lived in it. If you were an activist, you were radical, because at that time, activism, at least of any confrontational nature, was discouraged. You could seek change, just not too much, not too fast, not too loudly. On campus, the increased awareness and activism led to the addition of the rights of students and their role in the university and its governance as to the list of issues of the day. Campus became a constant whirl of activity. Free speech platform was being used. Provocative speakers challenged students to stand up. New organizations for political and cultural goals were being formed. Posters, leaflets, bullhorns became the staples of communication. Students outside of fraternities and sororities were getting elected to student government, and new demands being placed on how the university ruled students. And the draft buses kept leaving, despite the shouts of "hell no, I won't go." This activism and changing culture wasn't confined to campus. The community of Eugene began to change as well. The anti-war movement brought people of all ages, all walks of life, and all parts of the community together. People in the community were beginning to change the community, creating new institutions and becoming politically involved themselves. Among them, Cindy Wooten, who's here today, and her husband, Bill Wooten, who managed to both connect the counterculture, and the political activism. 1968, though, accelerated the level of discontent and activism. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the assassination of Kennedy and King, the 68 Democratic Chicago Convention, events in Europe, like the student riots in France, the Prague Spring liberalizations that led to an eventual Soviet invasion. I turned 21 in Omaha. Kind of sounds like an old Merle Haggard song, but I turned 21 in Omaha the summer of 1968, working the night shift for the Omaha World Herald. When I got back to campus, the atmosphere had decidedly changed. More angry, more determined, and more receptive to the necessity of political activism. Everything had escalated. Now, most of my college days to that point had been spent as an observer, not a participant, covering and commenting things as part of the student paper. My first sit-in was at Johnson Hall over the lack of inclusion of students in the selection process for the next president of the university. The next year, as editor of the Emerald, I moved to a new household. It included the student body president and the editor of the yearbook. It also included 2 women, one married to a household member, the other the manager of a coffee house. It became a center of activity, a drop-in for political discussions, strategy sessions, general philosophical exchanges about the state of the world, weekly gatherings in the little sunroom to watch Star Trek, even parties with an occasional Ken Kesey sighting, even, I added this, even a hand-cranked ice cream booth at the first Renaissance Fair with some special ice cream. It was at this point that the growing cultural gap with my parents hit its peak, something we probably all experienced at some point. My parents never objected to my opposition to the war, but they didn't like how I was expressing it, and they feared I'd get arrested. Yet what bothered them most was actually the idea of me cohabiting a house with women, even though I wasn't involved with either one. My mother's imagination just ran wild about what goings on there must be there. She took all kinds of measures, including taking back the car, to get me to change my mind, which I did not do. All my extracurricular activities meant that in spite even 2 terms of summer school, I still didn't have enough credit to graduate, so I continued in school. By 70, all the years of people organizing against the war had produced a loose coalition of organizations opposed to the war, though with differing strategies and level of activities, and their own peculiar rhetoric. One group, for example, the Faculty Student Coalition, aimed at the electoral process, gathered 50,000 signatures to present to Mark Hatfield in support of his resolution to end the war. Other groups were more focused on organizing street protests, mobilizing crowds. I ran for student body president in the middle of protests and student strike over the invasion of Cambodia and the killing of students at Kent State. This is going to generate a couple stories. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but one demonstration led to the student takeover of the student union, kind of an occupation. However, as leaders of the protest, we found ourselves with one problem. How do we keep up the momentum? How do we keep enough people coming out night after night in order to not only keep control of the student union, but to keep up the anti-war activities? The new, now old law school was being built. We sat over some beer at Maxie's, and we came up with the solution. Let's close 13th Street. We spent $24 for bricks. Someone appropriated some wheelbarrows and cement from the construction site. A landscape student actually showed up with some plants, and we even sent someone to measure the code requirements for fire truck access. The next night, demonstrators built brick planters at both ends of the campus and spent endless hours over the ensuing days protecting them from anyone who wanted to tear them down. Not too long after, the city council officially closed the street to traffic. In 1970, I saw the attempts to burn down ROTC and calling of National Guard onto campus. Confrontations had become more frequent, more provocative. When I ran for student body and president in 70, it was a time of concern about violence. Violence about war, violence that was invading the protests. I remember once that to assure potential supporters of my nonviolent nature, one Vietnam vet supporter of mine actually circulated leaflets in the freshman dorms announcing, "Eachus likes flowers and cows and stuff." In 1971, student government sued the State Board of Higher Education for more control over incidental fees, which it used to finance many student programs that exist today, including Osberg. Students could not only attend, but I could speak at faculty meetings. We installed a rock band as the official pep band for the student section at football games. Instead of a canoe fete, Parents' Weekend was declared a day of communication between generations and included a mass gathering of parents and students in Mac Court for a dialogue that was admittedly tense. I remember the 60s because I was there. It had a lasting effect, and I have a well of memories of the excitement, the exploration of ideas, and the camaraderie of common cause and condition. But I also recall how intense it was, how difficult decisions were, how divisive things became. I remember the 60s, and I don't really want to have to go through that again. I have difficulty explaining sometimes the 60s to younger generations that didn't experience. It's hard for them to relate to a draft supporting a questionable war, or to imagine what conflicts come from one friend getting an exemption from the war while in college and another friend who didn't go to college having to go and fight in that war. Or what your parents of the greatest generation felt when they saw their offspring turning against what they thought was the America that they'd preserved. Younger people can usually relate to the conflicts between parents and children over actions and attitudes, but society is much more open and diverse than it was then, so it is hard for them to understand what it was like in the 60s. We're often left with, oh, did the counterculture succeed? It's always a question when you ask the 60s and someone asks, did you succeed? Did it make a difference? Well, I'll offer this. Political victories were hard to come by in the 60s. We lost most of the political battles. The counterculture, though, including its component of political activism, has been absorbed since then in so many ways that it's only when we look back, as Suzy did in her book, that we realize what seeds were sown. Talking before this, my friend Cindy, and talking about how in the 70s we started to see some of the positive impacts. We started to see successes. And a lot of that is what Cindy described as an aggregation. The previously isolated campus community and the newly developing Eugene cooperative community coming together to make things happen. And those things have existed today, whether it's continuation of movements for civil rights, for women, for gays, for the environment, for recycling, or it's events like the Renaissance Fair or the Country Fair, or the arts and theater that are part of the culture and atmosphere and attraction of Eugene. That all grew out of this period of time of what would be called a counterculture. I don't want to have to go through it again, because I don't want to have to go through battles over war and poverty, although there are times when you look in the future and you wonder if maybe it's not coming again. But we can look back on the 60s and you can laugh at the pictures and you can remember all the times, but I think in the end we can actually say a lot was accomplished and it's still going on. Thanks.
Next up, we have Sparky Roberts. Do I have to do something? Oh, there we go.
pictures so you'll take me seriously. Renaissance in blue jeans and tie-dye. Stand up, please, Tim Blood. Okay. This is one crazy artist's continuing odyssey here amongst you people. My most effective creative medium is theater, where I can combine music, visual arts, writing, acting, and directing. And I've always felt that there was an empathic connection through nonverbal communication. Now, artists, as you know, can't help it. We have to do our art. It's a calling, like a doctor or a priest. My former husband and I were both Californians who spent our higher education years in Boston, and then we worked there. And when he took a job at the University of Oregon Biochemistry Department, I was relieved to move away from tense Boston's world of professional theater. I looked forward to rainy contemplation and life as a painter and practitioner of yoga. I couldn't predict, so I was a serious theater person, and this is one result of what happened here. So I couldn't have predicted that there would be theater opportunities here, but it wasn't long before I was at it again, full bore. So this should, there we go. Could not have predicted. That goes with that idea. Oh boy, okay. For my master's thesis project at Brandeis, which was a liberal school, I trained a troupe of students in acting, and we did street theater to protest the Vietnam War. When I came here in 1970, Eugene already had a history of war protests. And already affectionately known as Blue Jeans, Oregon, Eugene was informal, which I liked. The people seemed more real, and they were preoccupied with health. It was a mecca for a young person with a vision of experimental art, and especially in communication. It appealed to me that Wayne Morse lived here. To me, he was a hero, independent-minded, called everybody's senator. He stood up alone in Congress, almost alone, in opposition to the war. And I prepared for Oregonian culture by reading Ken Kesey's book, Sometimes a Great Notion. Kesey was one of the first people I met in Eugene. And the other firsts were Lottie and George Streisinger. Lottie, a potter, was already a mover and shaker in local arts and crafts. She started the Saturday Market, which later spawned the Holiday Market, I think the Renaissance Fair as well, the Oregon Country Fair, and that activism was a precursor for Fifth Street Public Market as well. Lottie told me that in 5 years I'd know everyone in my field, and in 10 years I'd know everybody. And I've reveled ever since in meetings with remarkable people. My Eugene stint became permanent. I stayed when my husband moved on. Eventually, like most artists here, I had to foster national and international exposure for my work in order to keep up in my field. Fortunately, creative collaborators who moved to Europe and other places still wanted to work together. And so I've traveled, but Eugene is still the best place to come home to. I did plenty of time in New York performing in concerts with John Cage and other avant-garde composers, but I knew I couldn't live there. The pressure, the noise, the strident competition. And some of my friends couldn't understand how I'd be satisfied living in Oregon so off the beaten track, but when they came to visit, they understood, and some were even a bit jealous. I'm going to move these along here. This was the welcome wagon here. My graduate advisor was my teacher, Dr. Abraham Maslow, called the father of humanistic psychology, and he encouraged me to combine professional fields as I had been doing in Boston. He thought it would benefit therapists. He said actors, especially improv actors, cut across problems of identity that psychologists are only beginning to understand. And he said, don't expect to make a lot of money because most people won't understand what it is you do. Well, there used to be a Zuzu's. Yeah. I've had to be resourceful, and I'm never bored. To make ends meet, like all artists in Eugene, I juggle jobs and always have to be ready to use anything in my bag of tricks. So I'm never bored. There's hardly any downtime. what I've done here might, at first glance, have looked counterculture, but it was based in legitimate training and for a long time was associated entirely with the University of Oregon. The late Horace Robinson, founder of the University Theater Department, understood my work, and I was hired at UO to teach movement and mime. And later I offered interdisciplinary workshops for various departments. Yoga always mixed in. My daughter and I have a long-running routine conversation that goes like this. You were a hippie, Mom. No, I wasn't a hippie. You were, Mom, you were a hippie. No, I was not a hippie. So I recounted this to her the other day, and she said, well, you were kind of a hippie. I said, well, I guess I have to go along with that. In 1970, Eugene was in the nascent stage of renaissance. A mushrooming art scene was beginning to entwine itself into the mainstream classical art forms and was redefining the local culture. There were a half dozen small theater groups and solo performing artists. Who remembers the Odyssey Coffee House, the Gramercy Theater, which was very small, both sat right where the Hult Center is now. And later, when I had a job as grounds entertainment coordinator at Benton County Fair for 15 summers, I used to muse while driving back and forth. Most of the people on those lands I passed would never attend theater, and yet theater is what keeps me busy all the time. I've enjoyed opportunities here that might have been completely missed, and people might have been completely missed in a bigger city. It was propitious that our first house here we rented from Thurza Anderson, who left sculptures in the garden from when the house doubled as her art gallery. She was pleased to have me paint the walls. My path was one of the many possible creative paths to legitimacy. I believe I was Eugene's first Hatha yoga instructor. The classes were large. Many of our present-day town fathers and mothers attended those classes that met every Monday evening for 7 years at the Friends Meeting House on Onyx Street. Hard to imagine that a time when yoga was still too far out for most people. Some of my students wanted to have a mime troupe, so we trained and rehearsed outdoors on the campus in the summer. Our first show was a tribute to the Olympic track trials, and soon our experimental theater style grew in acceptance. Having no home or institutional support, we remained mobile, and we were getting invitations from near and far. We did hundreds of performances in art galleries, parks, fields, schools, the state prison, and theaters from Eugene to Seattle. Now I hope I don't need help here.
The Mime Circus performs a summer free-for-all. Free for you, free for me, free for all. Opening on the Mall July 25th. Watch for us in a park near you. New Mime Circus Summer Free-for-All. Brought to you by Eugene Parks and Recreation.
Okay, we always revisited U of O venues, staging our shows in alternative spaces, such as the newly built 2-story lobby of the new Student Union, where we hung a swing from the upper floor, the Art and Architecture building lobby, where we built a giant turntable stage, MacArthur Court for Ken Kesey's poetry hoo-haws. Anybody go to any of those? There were 2 of them. And the Museum of Art. And we'd look for any open space and imagine doing theater there. And we performed at all the public events. In 1974, we became a nonprofit tax-exempt corporation, got grants from the Eugene City Room Tax, from the federal CETA funding, which lasted only 2 years, and the Oregon Arts Commission. We got a board of directors and held workshops and training sessions. Musicians, artists, and composers came to collaborate with us. This is when the mall had a fountain. I was in a couple of Ed Ragazzino's big musicals for the Eugene Festival of Musical Theater, and he eventually hired me to teach at Lane, where he was department head and he was responsible for building the theater. But he would say of dealing with the administration, I'm tired of trying to legitimize our existence. Such is the lot of the arts in this country. One of our founding members James A. Day, was also the founder of Lane Regional Arts Council, now Lane Arts Council. This is a changing configuration of characters that we had in our company, various periods of time. New Mime Circus became a way of life for the ever-evolving configuration of members. We enjoyed the annual visits of Pickle Family Circus and San Francisco Mime Troupe. I brought with me the influences of the group choreography of Eastern groups that I'd seen, companies of Alwyn Nicolai and Momix. But those days were pre-Cirque du Soleil. I still collaborate with playwrights and filmmakers, artists and composers who are happy to visit little old blue jeans. That's Open Gallery, Stephen Oschatz, who's a local artist, one of our long-term collaborators. When the Halt Center finally opened in 1981, some of Stephen's work, he was doing body printing and for a gallery with naked people stamped on big screens. Even the director of the Halt Center warned us of the costs of a union house. And sure enough, local companies dropped like flies into the financial black hole of Calcutta. The path to legitimacy was couched in what seemed countercultural at the time, but ever since we've built upon our shared, unique past, the human element, that's Eugene. This was the first mural on the Fifth Street Public Market, painted by Stephen Oschatz. Even before most of our members moved on, and we became a show school, we had moved away from identifying with mime per se. We were using, that's James A. Day on the left. He also started a gallery, first called Artists Union and then called Kairos. So we graduated from silent acting to total theater, and we went indoors. We didn't want to work just in the summer, but all year. For one thing, mime got a bad name in the 80s, with some tasteless and talentless mimes popping up in parks to follow people and ridicule them, or standing frozen on street corners waiting for someone to pay them to move. A friend of mine says that annoying mimes are basically people who are really pissed off because something really difficult that they've spent a lot of time and energy learning is making them no money at all. Nothing is ever certain for a performing artist in Eugene, or anywhere for that matter. In theater, teaching and doing children's theater are the most stable jobs. We're always jockeying, juggling. The terms full-time, part-time are irrelevant. Look at George Carlin back then. Oh. That's when the Willamette Valley Observer existed, and that became What's Happening, and that became Eugene Weekly. The goal is, of course, to become, no, we weren't the only group using the mall. This was ORT, Oregon Repertory Theater's, about their production of Midsummer Night's Dream on the fountain there. This was a show at the university here, Art Museum of Crafts, handcrafted fashions that Lottie Streisinger organized. And they redid the throne room and had Ed Coleman, Professor Ed Coleman, and his wife Charmaine as a jazz group to accompany it. So our goal is to be our most creative selves all the time. It's a small market, but there's plenty of work. Usually the usual petty gossip and competition is there, but eventually we all work with our rivals, so we tend to respect each other and even refer each other for jobs. And I'm just going to go quickly through some of these. That was one space that we used that was actually a preschool. Go back to that. That had a geodesic dome in it, and we were doing a poetry play. And we thought it would be fun to have that dome in the play. So we actually turned it into a theater, had an audience come in there. It wasn't a very big audience. This was Creation of the World and Other Business by Arthur Miller, an unknown play by Arthur Miller, who also wrote us a letter about it in response to my telling him my interpretation of how we were going to do the play. He asked me, did it work out? Hard to see that, huh? Yeah. sir. Old age. Really old. Jane killing Abel with a mine stick. And then my dad came, he saw that, and he said, you know, you're doing good work, but it's not commercial. You can't make any money doing that. And so I sort of got this new idea of commercialism that had never occurred to me before. And so we started doing children's theater. Now both of these plays were done in the Wow Hall, which we appropriated as a performance space, and we called it the Community Center for Performing Arts, or it was being transformed at that time. This is in I think Good Samaritan, where we would just go, do our makeup in front of everybody, and perform. Okay.
Great. You really add something to the community. I remember, let's see, it was an article in the newspaper on Sunday, wasn't there, stating that the New Line Circus is uniquely Eugenian. It was a nice expression about the New Line Circus.
That's right. Eugene really nurtured the growth of this group and this concept. Besides the training school, which is like a conservatory, and a professional performing company that does entertainment, we are also a public service group. We do shows for people who otherwise might not have shows.
That must be difficult being both a public service group and a professional, and people realizing that you have to get paid for what you do, that you do out professionally, you out there, you're trying to make a living at it. And so you do need just compensation as well as the people who work with you.
Right.
And so you have to get across sometimes.
Then we did a play called Macbeth, which was a strange parody of Macbeth, an anti-war play written by a man named Eugene Ionesco. How many here have ever heard of Eugene Ionesco? Okay, he was called the father of absurdism, and one of my idols, because I feel I'm absurd. And the most amazing thing about this production, well, Stephen Oshets, this was us doing our makeup in the Wow Hall over the radiator. And the Wow Hall, the heating system had to be fed downstairs, sawdust heating, with a little cup into this great big funnel. And we had to go down it, and it never got warm anyway because it wasn't insulated. But we had a set that was put together by Stephen Oshats, those arms and legs, a big hand and face, and the script calls for the set to bleed. It's a rabidly anti-war play. And the most amazing thing about it was that Eugene Ionesco came. This was his only trip to the United States of his whole life. And he happened to come, he was coming to the Romance Language Department at the University of Oregon. And we were in final dress rehearsal for his show, and he came and saw it. And he said he appreciated the humor that we brought to, there he is, and his little wife, sitting at the Wow Hall. So this is one of those chance meetings. He didn't go to New York, he came to Eugene. And this is me pulling out my bag of tricks, which is about 100 puppets that I have, and puppets became kind of a big part of. Okay. This is. Bag of tricks. Gotta use them all. Okay, so axolotl. This was at the University of Oregon, developed for this museum, but it also moved to Portland after we were finished performing here. Only 40 people at a time could watch it. It was the brainchild of Jan Coleman, who's there with one of her artworks, and mime circus to be the dancers to wear their creations. And Kate Wilhelm and Damon Knight well, Kate's still around, Damon's gone now, but they're award-winning science fiction and spec fiction authors. And Kate came and watched our improvisations with the magical objects and wrote a play for us. And this was got a National Endowment for the Arts grant. The two artists got the grant to have this done. It's the story concerned a group of space travelers who have been asleep until they are awakened to this exhibit, which transforms them. They touch the objects and wear them and become transformed by them. That's pictured on the cover of this Cultural Guide to Lane County, 1978, I guess it was, or 9. And I'll show you a little piece of that. No, I guess I might have cast it already. Is there a black screen? Yeah.
I think I've changed quite a bit through doing this.
Time's up. Up to you.
You have to experience fear and terror.
Okay, I'm being asked to hurry through, so I'm going to. I think since I have so much stuff on here, I better just kind of wrap it up now. I'm still finding uses for some of the same techniques that were developed with this original group. Training children, doing shows for children, shows for not children, and all of the same ideas and ideals are as appropriate for Shakespeare, I've discovered, as they were for just completely original works that we kind of just pulled out of nowhere. So Eugene has definitely been a nurturing ground, almost a petri dish for the development of a vision that started when I was quite young. And now I just kind of sneak it in around the edges to everything that I do. And I'm happy to still be here, even though, you know, a lot of people wouldn't understand that. Cindy, after all, is trying to come back. So I know there's value in it, in being here in Eugene. Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Kim Still talking about the Saturday market.
It's my first PowerPoint. My name's Kim Still, as you now know, and as I had Jesse introduced me, raised by artists in South Eugene, and I saw my dad here at some point, and he may have, oh, there he is, right there. He's partly to blame for all of this. Anyway, when I was working on this, I got interested in thinking about how the counterculture of the 70s is really the core culture of Eugene in many ways now. And that's come up actually several times as people have been talking about this. Here is May 9th, 1970. And that is the first day of Saturday Market. This is from the Augur alternative newspaper. And on May 9th, 1970, I was already a seasoned veteran of epic sales, Maud Kern's clothesline sales, art openings here and there, and the first Renaissance Fair, and every other art event in town. And so when there was another new art event in town, we piled in the car and all headed down to see what was going on. So let's see what happens next, because I can't remember. Anyway, skip ahead to 1977, and I am faced with a $319 term bill for the University of Oregon to get my degree in art history. And so rather than find a job like a good, normal person would, I decided, hey, I'll make some stuff and I'll sell it and make some money at Saturday Market. Because by then, Saturday Market was well established. So there's me selling puppets, and I've actually sold puppets at the Saturday Market with the help of my parents. Dad painted the faces on those puppets, and I sewed them together, and my mom sewed them together. So together, we sold puppets at the Saturday Market. And then many years later, when I was tired of my job at the Bijou, I got to be the manager, and that's very exciting and lovely thing that's happened for the past 20 years. So in 1970, Lottie Streisinger had been running epic sales, which were also part of the anti-war movement, where craftspeople got together to protest by making their own stuff and selling it to people. She was a potter, so you can see her pottery there in the background. She still comes to market almost every week. And she had a vision for that people should be able to sell their crafts, and that people should be able to come and buy those crafts every week in downtown Eugene. So May of 1970, they got permission. They sold in the alley next to the Over Park, which is now behind the DAC, and jammed in there all summer long. And then at the end of that experiment, oh, dude, it turns out that we were camping on the doorstep of the man, and the man was not happy about it. So I have an article here, an editorial from the Register Guard, Saturday Market, should it continue? And part of the objections of the people were actually, the people were the men, mostly, who owned businesses in downtown Eugene. Because businessmen were angry because those selling at the market don't have to pay rent, taxes, or other expenses of permanent establishments, although those who participate have paid a $1 fee, later reduced to 50 cents for cleanup costs. So the argument one was that the market was unfair business competition to businesses downtown. But also noted a complaint heard frequently from those opposed to the market that it attracts many persons described as hippies. Yes. Yeah. Here's a quote from Everett Smith, who was the chairman of Special Committee on Renewing Eugene, who were some of the people behind helping Lottie and the Eugene Crafts Guild get going. Less explicit, but perhaps more insidious, objections came from critics who charged first that vendors in the Saturday market are not paying for business costs, and second, that people in the market wear their hair longer and wear less fashionable clothes than most persons who spend time and money in the city center. So, fortunately, we got past that. So after a great deal of argument with the county commission, the market was given permission then to sell in 1971 on the plaza in front of the courthouse. Then in 1972, we moved across the streets to the Butterfly parking lot. This is Malou's Honor Cardin, Olswang, and I don't remember what her last name is now, but she was the manager for the for 1971 and 1972. So here's 1973, we got to move to this beautiful place. And I went down, while I was working on this, I went into the basement and rummaged around and found some boxes of slides from 1973. So most of these slides are from the summer of 1973. And part of what made me curious about this whole issue of culture, counterculture, is that market never really felt countercultural to me, since raised by artists in South Eugene. It just seemed like a normal thing to do, that you would make stuff and sell it. But anyway, I found this great little piece of writing from something called the Bullfrog Information Service, which was a 2-year-long experiment in alternative journalism, apparently. Anyway, a gentleman named John Luna wrote this little bit about Saturday Market. And what struck me was that it could have been written last week, really, about Saturday Market, because things don't change. And while I read this, I'm going to just show you setting up on the parking lot. So the emphasis of the market, says John Luna, is placed on workmanship, beauty, and durability, qualities often lacking in our consumer-oriented, mass-produced economy. Most market people see the Saturday market as a positive alternative to the gargantuan shopping complexes chock full of shoddy plastic commodities. The weekly market also facilitates one kind of alternative lifestyle in which people can earn a simple living from their craftsmanship and transcend the alienation from work that is inherent in most employment. It seems to be a search for the unification of work and play, an integration of life, energy, and production, a maximum freedom to structure one's own time within the totalitarian framework. Unfortunately, however, the market can support only a minuscule amount of people compared to the total, and should not be looked on as any real countercultural alternative to the dominant industrial economy. In our highly specialized technocratic society, this was in 1971, our personal survival depends in many ways on a collective production distribution process. Individual handcrafted production has some very definite limitations. And I just lost my place. And it would be incredibly naive to envision the Saturday market or the craftsman lifestyle posing any serious threat to the capitalist monolith. Just as the large armament, transportation, steel, oil, and food corporations amusingly tolerate the head shops, food co-ops, and underground newspapers and other counterculture ventures, the Saturday market on an economic level is merely another mosquito bite on the ass of a mighty tough elephant. But that's not to say the Saturday market isn't a vital, living, beautiful thing. There's a powerful contrast between the down-home, funky Saturday market and that gleaming edifice of anality, Valley River Center. It's the classic battle of the forces of life versus the forces of death, but in muted form. The Saturday market is alive. Well, yeah. So I'm happy to report the Saturday market is still alive. And here we are setting up the park blocks. When I started to sell at market, we were indeed not on the park blocks, I mean the butterfly lot. And so there we are. 1973 was actually a big boom year for the market, where we at some point had too many, yeah, there were hippies there. Okay. But the thing is, as you look at these pictures, notice how many just kind of normal, everyday people are there too. So this is Dick Cross, and he actually invented our beloved classic wooden market booth that everybody used to have before pop-ups came along. Some people still do. We do. All right. Yes, that's true. These, like I say, these are from the teriyaki burgers, $1. So somebody's selling on a blanket, taking a nap. Curious to know why there's bleach right there, but I just really don't know. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, it has something to do with the coffee, I presume, but I don't want to know about it. Commerce. This is one of the reasons I think Saturday market is still around, is commerce. You know, it's a cultural phenomenon that exists around the world. People need to make money. And the great thing about Saturday market is, as long as you make what you sell, that is the original rule and the original vision of Saturday market, is that the people would make things that they sold. That is still our rule. We still are, that's our core concept that we meet about every month, about what is handcrafted and what is not handcrafted. So these people are so cute. That woman, the pants in the background, those denim patchwork pants, just crazy. The Lucy booth. Do you remember the Lucy booth? The doctor is in. Now we have websites 5 cents and architecture 5-cent booths. Sort of spun off of the Lucy booth, I guess. And so there's batik T-shirts in the wind. In 1971, the market made a proposal to the County Board of Commissioners to move into the park blocks where we are now, which is now controlled by the city instead of the county. I don't know. Anyway, the county commission ultimately denied it, but many of the things in the proposal are so much still happening right now. And the market, number one reason, the market provides a unique and compelling reason for people in the area to come to downtown Eugene, to shop, do business, and seek entertainment. Number two is the market serves, and it's an unusual and valuable bridge between people of different cultures and different ages, a potentially important ingredient in the continued health and vitality of the whole community. The market provides a nostalgic link with the historical past because it takes place in the site of the original farmers market in downtown. This is Joe Kasich playing his flutes. I just love the look on this woman's face. She's so fascinated by it. I have one of those flutes, actually. I have one of a lot of these things. Because, you know, you sell stuff, you trade stuff. You gather sacred objects that you never let go. Leather purses, still in style. It's coming up in a minute. Was looking down from the top over people. This is actually before Dick Cross invented the market booth, because nobody has one in these pictures. And everyone just kind of has a free-for-all setup of booth spaces, which we've gotten over since then. This is Janet Naylor, who's a harpist who plays at market all the time. She probably doesn't know I have this picture of her, because I didn't know I had it, but apparently she used to sell perfume. She also worked at the U of O for many years. Boutiques in the background, and a very happy person with some lunch. This is sort of part of proving my point about people getting along together. There's a little sign underneath the home-baked breads. It says, "He's not yet been honored by a visit from the Department of Health." Regardless, the gentleman in the dapper fedora hat has purchased a loaf of bread anyway. He's taking a risk, I guess. But I forgot to put the guy's last name. It's Brian somebody from the Eugene Auger. And the cover of the Auger says, "Work, what is it?" So there's our info booth. I have one of those candle lanterns, and I just still love it dearly. This is Helen Tolson, quite a beautiful woman back in the day, and Helen's New Age sandwiches. There were some questions in the early days about the food preparation, but we've gotten over that for sure. The county people show up every week and inspect our food court. There's Ray Sewell, working on something, making some food. Yeah, back when he was just a slender young lad. Somebody working on wood. Just sort of market scenery. There's Gil Harrison. And yeah, as many people know, Gil passed away last month, or in January. Was part of the market from the very, very beginning. And I'm pretty sure this is Gil's pottery. Okay, good, because obviously I can't ask him about it, but yeah, before the color came in there. But he still made cups with that shape. That's how I knew it was his pottery from way back when. This is Faith Rahill, and there's a little headline that you can't see on that newspaper. It says ex-Eugenian, now a stewardess. So yeah. It's Faith Rahill. Somebody named Peter who made pottery. Selling pottery. I kind of put all the potters together because they tend to do that anyway. There's Walter Alley. This was actually 1980. Selling Olympic trial souvenirs. So we're not beyond doing that sort of thing. There's Faye Nakamura. Back when she used to sell at Saturday Market. Turned wood bowls. These people, the Winsteads. I want to know these people. I don't know who they are, but they look like they're having a great time. So this is sort of the point 6 of this manifesto here. The market enables vendors of wares who have only irregular outlets for offering their work an opportunity to make goods centrally available to potential buyers. These vendors include people who make their living by working with their hands, senior citizens, small farmers, weekend craftsmen, housewives, and students. In the American tradition of free enterprise and self-sustaining individual productivity, provision of an outlet for such endeavors adds to the general stability of the entire economic community during a time when there is a shortage of jobs and unemployment is high. The sale of handcrafted and individually produced items helps a number of vendors avoid dependency on public subsidy for income. Well, I would like to say that is still absolutely true. So this is the reason that I think that Saturday Market has persisted and become indeed woven into the fabric of Eugene, besides the support of all of our countercultural brothers and sisters at the country fair and Sundance and Bring and Whitebird and all of those places that were born in the 70s. That really it's people of all ages and all economic levels just coming together to hang out, make some money, buy some stuff, do the usual thing. There's a You Pick House Numbers booth next to the info booth. That was sort of fun to see. And market goers. Inkle Loom, who remembers Inkle Looms? I still have one. I haven't used it for a long time, but I still have one. Where there's a market, there will be entertainment, including Joe Kasich again with his flutes. This is Miss Rander, I think. Right there in the middle, I see George or Jorge right there, and there's another picture of Miss Rander. Janie Smith, who's playing the flute, sells lamps and lampshades at Saturday Market right behind the stage. Still, to this day, more people playing music at Saturday Market, and more people playing music at Saturday Market. We also actually have a Karamazov on site in the past. I don't know. Are these new mime circus people? If not, at least they're mimes. So there were mimes. There was street theater, something to do with the Pope. I'm not sure what, but it was probably irreverent. Dance, always a good thing to have at market. And I'm pretty sure there's a group called Quantiform Dance Tourage, which is an amazing name for any group. Vaughn Avery, back in the day. Yeah. People playing music for kids, and I think it was part of the tricycle parade that happened frequently. The tricycle parade. Earl Kelly was a common sight for many years at the market with his trombone. And then I threw in some pictures of people that still sell at Saturday Market. There's Patty White, sells tie-dye right next to the stage. Looks just like that. And there's Moon Rainbow there on the far right, and she still sells at Saturday Market as well. And Louise Thompson, I see her every once in a while. And we were looking at this in the office, and I said, I think that's Louise. And everyone else said, no, it's somebody else. And about 10 minutes later, she walked in the door. So she said, yeah, that's me. That's Bill Pugsley, who makes knives, and Vicky and Moon Rainbow. So, and then I couldn't have a slideshow without putting Eileen and Howard in there, because they were the managers in this when I was at market. And then there's Skeeter, Duke, and Patty Lamont, who are regular market goers, who most of you know these people. So anyway, what do you think of Saturday Market? I posted this on Facebook the other day because it was so cute. Well, I think it's pretty nice. They work pretty hard to get it there. Oh yes, I think it's nice. I go there quite often. We go quite often, but mainly in the summertime, not this time of year because it's cold and wet. And then my daughter has a booth there, but I've never gone. You have to park so far away, and I don't feel like walking that far, but we'll try to go next week. So I posted this, and someone commented, Diane McWhorter, who sells at market, people still say exactly the same thing when you ask them about Saturday Market. This is one of my favorite things that Lottie had to say about Saturday Market. And through everything all of the manifestos and rules and things, this is right in there, along with you have to make it yourself, is that the marketplace is a true mixture of ages, incomes, and lifestyles, meeting with ease and pleasure. And so as long as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness includes, for some of us, earning a simple living from craftsmanship, transcending the alienation from work that is inherent in most employment, unifying work and play, and finding maximum freedom to structure our own time, and for other of us, buying things the Joneses couldn't even find at Walmart, we will be downtown at the core.
Okay, so from the amount of murmuring and chatter I heard in the audience, I'm sure people have questions or comments for our panelists. Maybe not. Yeah?
Well, one thing I like to add is, I work in the industrial part, I'm a machinist, and I meet a lot of people that have never been to the market for different reasons. But one of the interesting reasons people say is the food. Well, I don't know about the food down there. And I tell them, I said, they get inspected. It's probably the best food you're ever going to have and the most inspected food you're going to have. And I explained to them how critical the health department is, that everything has to be just right, and hand washing and all this stuff. And you can't even shake hands with food people. You have to touch elbows. Otherwise, you got to wash your hands. I mean, it's amazing that they do that. I said, you're probably going to have the cleanest food you're ever going to have anywhere, more clean than most restaurants at Saturday Market. And I try, wherever I go, I try to convince people, if you've never been here, you're missing something really special. Because the food alone is just worth it.
Yes, definitely. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I just wanted to thank Ron Eachus for being here. He aptly tried to bring together the evolving consciousness in nature, both in political perspectives as well as the cultural revolution that took place. And there was a melding and integration of the new cultural economy in Eugene with the university
It reminds me of a story. Since we're reminiscing and supposedly telling stories, I tell a story about my last reappointment to the Public Utility Commission when, due to legislation we've been working on, I actually had 7 Republicans willing to support me, and because Republicans controlled the legislature or the Senate at the time, I needed 7 Republicans. But one of them was not the chair of the committee. And the chair at the time was Senator Randy Miller, who could at times be fairly petty. And he started questioning. It was at the time that PUC was going after US West for service quality. Didn't like me and others, including the Oregonian, calling them US Worst. But so he thought we were being too hard on US West, and he started bringing up anti-war activities, things like that. And we got into the hearing, and he started asking questions about whether or not I'd ever been arrested, which I thought he was talking about demonstrations, etc. Actually, no, I hadn't. I was smart enough to determine escape routes well before the demonstration. But he kept asking about being arrested, and I had no, ever I'd broken the law. And I said, well, I'd probably driven over the speed limit, and I know I had beer before I was old enough. But he then, I said, I don't know what you're getting at. And so he asked, well, did you ever smoke marijuana? And I'd kind of been preparing for this question. So I just said, Senator, I went to the University of Oregon in the late 60s. What do you think? The next day the headline in the Oregonian was, PUC chairman asked about pot, not power. The Republicans in the Senate got so many phone calls, or the governor got so many phone calls, and he referred them to the Republicans in the Senate, got so many phone calls that I actually got 14 Republican votes. Senator Miller actually stood up and stood up on my behalf, carried the nomination, and said that they had asked about my character and that I was a person of good character. So I can always tell people that I've been certified by Republicans in the Oregon State Senate as a person of good character.
Just quickly, one of the...
No rebuttals. Come on, I'm right behind here.
I was reminded of who came out of Congressman Reeder's office, including us, but it was just last year that the mayor of Seattle and the mayor of Portland both had been in Jim Reeder's office for Eugene.
And I think their head of Department of Environmental Quality, Jeff Goltz, was in the Washington, D.C. office.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question.
Well, this is a question, just a comment that also, as you all probably know, there was a really spiritual component to the 60s that we couldn't touch on. But I myself came out, I went into from the Jesus people. But I mean, all around Eugene, there's still this sense of exploring spirituality that came out, was a real component to Buddhism and Hinduism and all these things. Because I remember in the early 60s that philosophy was God is dead, and no one was talking about spiritual things. And now, spiritual dialogue is something very real in Eugene.
If I could add, I think that's true, and it seems like there's a good opportunity here in Eugene on March 8th, or sometime, I can't remember the date, when the Dalai Lama's coming. May. March 11th is when tickets go on sale. But just in terms of reminiscing and recollection, I can't remember the person's name, but there was a ecumenical ministries, or there was a person at the campus ministries, and down at it was across from the old law school, I think. They had an office there, and that person, I wish I could remember his name and pay tribute to him, because he provided a lot of support. That was a time when, God may have been dead, but people were asking lots of questions about what's the right thing to do how much, not easy decisions about, particularly about getting drafted and what to do if you did, and there was a lot of help provided by the ecumenical population community to people trying to sort out what was right, what was moral, and that person in that particular organization played a major role on campus.
Well, we're running short on time, but are there maybe one more comment or question?
I got a quick story.
I think there's someone else. Yeah?
I think that we often don't pay enough attention to the role of the nonprofit as a counter institution during that time, and the ways that it really was instrumental in changing culture. It was such a contrast to movement politics, way of organizing ourselves to say, here's how we can do business and still be true to who we are, but put a public purpose equal with our own individual success. And it spread in so many different ways to so many different groups. And it's one of the things I think is we're stand to lose today, because that's been taken over by a number of, the whole idea of the nonprofit has been so diluted and has shifted so much as a way of, just look what has happened in politics in the name of nonprofits, and raising money. But I'd love to hear more from people about the role of that counter institution and how it served to change the culture.
Well, I think it was critical. I focused on campus, but gradually, for economic reasons, for reasons of just common values or whatever, a lot of the campus community at the time sought those places. They were not only, there were moral issues, and you wanted to try and do the right thing. You're also, there's a lot of economics if you're students or whatever about trying to get through school and how to manage finances, and it wasn't something confined to just students. There were a lot of people at the time, particularly a lot of people coming to Eugene who didn't want to live their lives in a way in which all they were doing is sort of giving themselves over to someone else who was exploiting them, and they were trying to find other ways to live within the world in a more cooperative way. And the nonprofits, not only some were political, but a lot of them were institutions replacing other institutions. Whether it was where you bought your groceries, or whether it was keeping the arts going, or all those things were critical. And it was a community outside of the campus that made that happen. And I think one of the things that happened in the 70s, where those things started to take place and started to succeed and establish themselves on an ongoing basis, was that once when the war ended and the weight of the war ended, a lot of energy could be spent towards more productive activities, and I think then that what happened was that it was sort of able to spend more energy on that and build on what had happened before, and those things became institutions that made what Eugene was. But it also, they sort of established, and I sort of alluded to when I was talking, that one of the things that happened, and then one of the things we lose sight of, is how a lot of the things that got started in the counterculture have gotten absorbed. They've become institutions that are, established parts of the community. And I think you hit on something we should all be concerned about, though, is that the image of the nonprofit and the reaction to it and the perception to it is whether it's something you want to participate in, contribute to, and be a part of in any way, is getting skewered by the use of the way nonprofit is being used today. You mentioned politically, I assume you're talking about the way nonprofits being used as a umbrella for to protect against disclosure and other kinds of things, and as well as the size of nonprofits have gotten pretty large. I mean, they don't have good purposes, but that kind of community intimacy is being lost. Yeah, it's a good observation. It's in right.
Okay.
So I want to tell another story.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I made mention in about going out of the 60s with the you couldn't get in even if you want to, physical exemption. One of the things that's changed, and I think one of the things that happens today in terms of how intensely people react to certain events, is that some of the pressures are gone. We don't have a draft. We have a volunteer army now. We don't have a draft, and I'm glad of that. I'd like to see a universal AmeriCorps draft where everybody has to contribute in some way for a couple of years, but military is only one option. But we don't have a draft, and at the time, you recall, the draft was ending, and then the lottery was introduced, and all of a sudden, those who got deferments were no longer going to get college deferments, and this was a pretty significant event to people. And I had just gotten elected student body president, and then I got my lottery number came up. So, and I'm going through some of these moral questions. What am I going to do? Am I going to go? Am I going to go to jail? Am I going to go to Canada? Are we going to try and get a conscientious objector status? I was in the process of doing the conscientious objector status. Jail might have been an option. Canada was not. All that stuff going through my head. And I go up for my physical. And I've decided one thing, because I don't know about you or the friends you have, but I had a lot of folks who were doing some pretty strange things to try and get out of the draft and find some way to get out. I decided if I'm going to do CO, I'm going to play it straight. So I go up there and I do the whole thing, physical, and you're around in a circle. In this case, it was a little Italian doctor, and he comes around and checks everybody and asks you to cough. No. And I coughed, and he kind of looks at me in a very accusatory manner, and he says, "Where is it?" And I have no idea what he's talking about. But he gives me a card and says, "I got to go in and see the Surgeon General, or the head surgeon." So I go in there, and he makes me jump up and down for about 20, 30 seconds. And then he hands me a card, a pink card, as it was, and says, you couldn't get into the Army even if you wanted to. Well, it turns out I had an undescended testicle, something I'd had throughout my life. Yeah, right. Which I'd had, but I never thought about it because there was no reason to. Everything functioned, whatever. I'd played athletics and never thought about it. But it turns out that you can't get in the Army if you only have one testicle. So I came back and I was telling people, I got to tell you the truth, man. I just don't have the balls for the Army.
I will say, when you were talking about that period of draft resistance, in Eugene, it was unbelievably searing as an experience. The draft office was at 11th and Willamette.
Yeah, it was downtown. The buses showed up there.
Right, and the FBI was there all the time for every kind of recruitment class that was supposed to be getting on those buses. And people were chaining themselves to the bumpers of these buses and to the doors, and the FBI was there, and they were trying to browbeat people. And I mean, the expressions on people's faces and the crowds and the magnitude of what was happening was real.
this leads into one of the things that one of the reasons I really loved Eugene, one of the reasons I stayed here, and over the years that I lived here that I enjoyed so much, was the arts and theater of Eugene, because it did such a good job of capturing some of the angst, some of the emotion, some of the absurdity of all of that, and the forces, and capturing the forces, the things that made, that created all of that pressure, and turning that into, modes of expression, and giving a meaning and conveying some of that meaning through the arts. I was Eugene. I remember the theater on the Mall, Shakespeare on the Mall, when that mall first got, how great that was. And there was a midnight theater. There was a normal theater, and then there was this midnight theater that would do this experimental plays just before the Holt Center was there. And it was one of the things that made Eugene so great, because there was just such an active and the improv group, comedy improv group that Cheney Ryan was part of, and there were 3 or 4 people in it. On the Edge. Thank you. Right. It was great.
Okay, well, we have to wrap things up now, but thank you all so much for coming. Thanks to our panelists. I think this was a really great event.